Hi and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week is part 2 of our 4-part Inner Child Work series. Last week we discussed listening to your inner child and how to sit with your inner child. And this week we're going to move on to talk about compassionately communicating with, establishing a dialogue with your inner child, and how to begin to teach your inner child the life lessons it needs to learn. Okay, David, so last week in our part 1 of this topic, we discussed listening with the inner child and encouraging our inner child to open up and speak to us. So I'd like to do a little recap just for new listeners on the sort of, frame of mind or the sort of vocal approach or the energy that we need to address our inner child with as we begin to speak to it.
Yes, Alex, this is really important because the mindset that I get from my clients is when I'm working with them is that part of the mind that we call the inner child is somehow their enemy, something they have to push away or something they have to ignore. So the subject we're going to talk about today, opening lines of communication. After you've listened, after you've got through the idea that the red light feelings, whether you want to call it anxiety, fear, stress, is maybe the inner child shouting out for your attention. After you've got that past that hurdle, here comes another big hurdle. How do you communicate with the inner child? And so it goes right down to the basics of really what we talk about on all of our videos. Truth, honesty, integrity. This is so important because remember when we say the inner child, we're using that term as a metaphor. It's a part of you. It's your mind. So if you do not speak with truth, with honesty, with integrity, you know yourself you're not speaking with truth, honesty, and integrity. So the conversation doesn't go anywhere.
So, and when you say you know yourself, I guess the inner child part of your mind also knows.
Exactly.
That you're trying to pull the wool over its eyes, trying to dismiss it, trying to pass it off quickly, not being truthful and honest.
That's the main thing that I find is not being truthful, not being radically, fundamentally truthful. So a lot of my clients will say, I really want to change. And then I say, do you really want to change? Does every part of you want to change? Because in most times, it's the inner child part of your mind doesn't want to change. It wants to stay on the familiar, a familiar path, even if it knows it's unsuccessful. And this is what a lot of my clients can't understand or accept, that the inner child will always choose a path that it knows, even if it doesn't work out. And you guess you're going to ask me, why? Well, because it believes it's in some form of control. The inner child wants to know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to happen. It almost believes that it's almost like got an insurance policy that even though it's not going to work out to the best outcome, it kind of knows it and it can adapt to it.
So it's one of the first things we need to speak to the inner child about is to do with that it needs to trust us, basically.
Yes.
In order to not only open up with us, but I guess begin to trust any advice that or any kind of conversational narrative that we have with that younger part of our mind that's stuck. We need to be very much in the role of the wise parent at this point.
Very much so, Alex. That idea that I like to put forward, if you're going to use this metaphor of the inner child, which I believe is probably one of the most powerful and profound ways that you can work with your emotional education and get more connected to your spirituality, I would like you to think about yourself as the spiritual parent and the inner child as your spiritual child. And there's so many things we can talk about here. One of the biggest hurdles that my clients find so difficult to get over, to get through, is first of all, you've got to navigate through the emotion. So the inner child will push you away, will box you off, is very clever, and it will always want to tell you how it feels. It wants to give you a feeling. I'm scared. I'm frightened. I can't cope. It's too much for me. I'm unlovable and I'm not good enough. And it will want to give you those feelings. It's almost like pushing you away. This is how I see it. And this goes back to your idea of trust. If it pushes you away and you can't get through that first hurdle, then it loses trust in you. How would it trust you? Because you can't see through that tsunami wave of emotion.
And I think, David, that for a lot of people at this stage, they may have, followed the advice that we gave in last week's teaching about listening, cutting through the emotions, listening to the complaints or the grievances or the upset, the thoughts behind the upset that the inner child might start offering. But then to be able to almost, what we're talking about now is establish a two-way dialogue where the inner child is talking, we're listening, and then we're feeding back, we're reassuring, we're establishing trust through reassurance. A lot of people can't quite grasp this idea of this is an exercise where we are talking to ourselves quietly, internally, sitting, on the sofa, on a park bench, just taking 10 minutes out of our day to do this inner child internal dialogue. And that it's almost like we have to almost split ourselves psychologically, that we need to answer and direct as the wise parent, the authentic part of ourselves, but we also need to then allow the inner child part of our mind to respond truthfully and honestly. And like we said, this conversation needs to be fully open, non-judgmental, truthful in both directions, because you will never get to the nub of the problem, the heart of the problem, without this truth.
That's right. And so part of this process is what we call in our model the golden thread process. The golden thread process is to be genuinely interested. So you have to negotiate the tsunami wave of emotion. And that takes practice from the spiritual adult part of you. You have to learn to look through that. So when you're doing the golden thread, how the child will throw you off the track is by giving you a feeling. And I always say, when you're doing this work, do not use the word I feel. If you're making a note of this, this is very important. Replace I feel with I think, I believe, or I choose. And so when the inner child says to you, I feel scared, what you believe you're scared, you think you're scared, you choose to be scared. I don't quite understand, son. So then I'll want to answer that and I'll say, well, I believe I'm scared. Oh, so what are you scared of? See, you can get past the emotion by that little technique. You get past the emotion and you start opening up the dialogue, and the part of your mind will then begin to tell you what it is. And it's normally like, I don't like the unknown. I want to be able to control. I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know what people think about me. I want to know if the worst case scenario happens, that I'm not going to be alone. I'm not going to be abandoned. I'm not going to be unloved. People aren't going to walk away from me. It will give you very fundamental spiritual problems, issues that it needs resolving.
And so, David, if we're, I guess, blessed enough to get to this point in the dialogue where we are getting down to those root issues and the inner child is speaking honestly, and the kind of parent part of our mind, we've asked the right questions, we've encouraged the inner child to talk about what it's thinking, what it's believing, what it's choosing, rather than what it's feeling. If the inner child gets to the absolute core of the thing that it's stuck on, the thing that is creating the top level red light feelings, and gives us the problem, the dilemma, almost like on a plate, but we don't know what to do with it. At the adult part of us, the parent part of us, what happens if we don't know the answer, or we kind of agree with what the inner child's saying?
I was just going to say, Alex, in my experience, it's not that you don't know the answer, but you kind of agree with what the inner child's view of the world is, that you could be abandoned, you could be rejected, you could be unloved. And so you come to an impasse. And that's when you stop being, as you said at the beginning, the wise spiritual person, the parent, and you become the inner child, and you're thinking the same. And then the dialogue breaks down. So if it gives you something like, I can be rejected, I do not want to be rejected. Let's use that as an example. We can use any example. Do you believe one human being can reject another human being? And if the spiritual person believes that's true, you need to do a little bit of research and work yourself, because now your education needs to be improved. And I would say it is quite acceptable to say to your inner child, I don't know the answer to that at the moment, but leave that with me and I'll do some research. Leave that with me for a few days and let me do some research, and I'll come back to you. And in our Facebook Wu Wei Wisdom community, those are the type of questions that members come to the community and ask. Can I be rejected? Can I be abandoned? And then you see all of the members start to give their comments because they've been through a similar track. And of course, no human being can reject another human being. We've done several videos on this. The idea is a hierarchical idea, which the inner child will accept because it sees things in yes and no and black and white and good and bad. So you have to educate the child, and that's where that truth, honesty, and integrity, and this builds up the trust. But if the inner child says, I think I can be rejected, and you go, oh, don't be silly, of course you can't. You're not having the conversation.
Yeah, it's like you're presenting back to the inner child another block in the same way that, it's almost like you're giving an inner childlike response to your inner child's complaint. I mean, I just wanted to just touch on one thing you said there. If the inner child presents something to us and we don't know the answer, or as you said, we actually agree with the inner child, then you said, then the inner child takes over. So what happens at that point, as I understand it, David, and tell me if I'm wrong? It's like we're trying to establish, when our inner child is really dominant, when we're overwhelmed by emotions, when the choices, the thoughts, actions and choices we're making in everyday life are led by emotions, fears, anxieties, fretting about the future. The inner child part of our psyche is very much dominant and in control. And what we're trying to do through this inner child work and this inner child reparenting, we're trying to reclaim some, I guess, psychological ground by allowing the authentic, spiritual, Shen, wise parent part of our psyche to have a voice. So this is always present within us, but the inner child and our ego tends to dominate it. It's very loud and it squashes it down. So through the act of inner child reparenting, we're trying to raise the profile again and increase the, I don't know if dominance would be the right word, the level to which our beliefs, our thoughts, our actions are dictated by the wise, authentic part of us, and put that parent part of our psyche back in control of the inner child, so the inner child isn't ruling the roost. But as soon as we agree with what the inner child is saying to us, I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough, I can't cope, I'm going to be abandoned, it's like the wise, authentic parent part of us steps back. It begins to let the inner child take over again. So the whole process of this inner child work and inner child communication is to readdress the balance between those two energies of our mind.
Yes. And how you finished off that, Alex, is the way that I see it. To make it simple, I see it as kind of a pendulum. And on the one side of the pendulum, you have the inner child who sees the world through a very childlike view of good and bad, right and wrong, yes and no. It always wants to be right. It always wants to know. It wants things the way it wants it, when it wants it, how it wants it. This is how the inner child works on this side of the pendulum. On this side of the pendulum, as Alex just said, you've got what we call Shen, the spiritual knowledge, the spiritual understanding, the intuition, if you like, the gut feeling, that inner knowing. So here's the pendulum. And really, what a lot of people try and do is to swing the inner child to here. And this is why the Wu Wei Wisdom model is so different. Really what we're trying to do is to come back into the center of the pendulum. We're coming back into a oneness. And really that's what Wu Wei means. If you remember that Taoist sign with the yin-yang sign and the curvy line in the middle, the curvy line is Wu Wei. And so rather than going to one extreme, the inner child, or swinging to the other extreme when you're just in a spiritual haze, we're trying to amalgamate, we're trying to bring those two together into a oneness. So the pendulum isn't swinging violently from side to side, or it's not stuck in one side or the other side. It's just gently swaying in the middle. And this is very important that the inner child understands this, because we're not trying to eliminate the inner child. We're not trying to cut it off at its knees and throw it away and say it has no value. The inner child has such tremendous value. I can tell you working all of my life with inner children, one of the greatest values of the inner child has is stubbornness. The inner child is tremendously stubborn, will dig its heels in. And that's not a bad thing if it's going in the right direction, if you're stubborn in the right direction about your life and what's important to you. So this work and this communication is to bring the pendulum down into the center so it's swaying in Wu Wei. And that's how I would view it when I'm working with my clients. The inner child is not a monster. Mm-hmm. It's not evil. It's not the devil sitting on your shoulders. It's a child. I view it as a child trapped in a dark, dank cellar, trapped in a corner, and been there since the age of 6, 7, 8, 9. And it really doesn't trust the outside world. It has got a very fixed mindset of how things should be and how he wants them or she wants them to be. And really what we're doing by these teachings is to give you the knowledge and the education that we can answer those questions, like the question, I don't want to be rejected. That's why we do these videos. So you can say, well, let me have a look, see what Alex and David says about that. Or let me join the community and see what other people says about that. So what it's doing, it's widening your knowledge, your understanding, and your narrative, that you can speak to the inner child in a knowledgeable way.
And I was going to say, David, if, as we said, the scenario which is common, the inner child presents us with a statement which we find hard to truthfully counter or offer an alternative view, it's okay to step back and say, let's revisit that. Yes. I need to think about this. Yes. So I can kind of help you with this.
Yes.
So, you know, if you believe you're going to be abandoned, if you believe you're unlovable, if you believe the world's against you, we have hundreds and hundreds of long form teachings on our YouTube channel on most of the topics that your inner child will ever present you with. Do a keyword search on our channel, find the video, spend half an hour allowing that kind of authentic parent side of you to watch the video, absorb the information, decide on your own view on it.
Yes.
So you can do the research that way.
Absolutely.
Or I think what a lot of people do is just almost sit in a quiet meditation to strengthen their connection back to their authenticity, to their Shen, to their wise gut feeling, inner knowing, and just sit with the question or sit with the statement that the inner child has given us. And then, as you say, ask yourself, once you've fully reconnected back to that authentic part of you, ask yourself, is this really the truth? Why might my inner child believe this? What happened to myself, my inner child, when I was younger that made me believe that I'm not lovable, that I'm not good enough, that I'm not worthy?
And to help you with this, we kind of develop little techniques to try and make it more accessible for you that you can develop and then use yourself. And the one that we're talking about now is what I would call the Shen test. And this is the Shen test. If your inner child says, for instance, I'm not good enough, and you think, oh, crikey, I don't know the answer to that. Imagine you had a physical child of 6 and 7, or a niece or a nephew that came to you and says, I need to tell you something very important. And you go, yes, sweetheart, what is it? I'm not good enough. How would you do with that then? You wouldn't say, well, you're probably right. Well, okay, let's do something else. Or let me run to bed, I've got a headache now. You would address that situation in a correct way. Something inside of you. For instance, maybe the first thing you would do is to give them a big hug. Maybe the first thing you'd do is take them in your arms and say, sweetheart, I love you. Do you ever do that to your inner child? And that's why that Shen test can be so important, because what you're doing, you're kind of reframing, you're refocusing your mind. And that's why I think the analogy of the inner child can be very helpful. That voice, that we all have an inner voice talking away at us. It's been talked about for centuries, millennium. Some people talk about the devil on the shoulders, the negative self-talk. And I think if you change that view to see it as a 6-7-year-old child who desperately has got their hands out and wanting help, but doesn't know how to ask for it, so it goes back to the only thing it knows, emotions. And then secondly, and most importantly, and why we call these series life lessons, here's the life lesson. And this is why it's so difficult for you. Because you will have to do something that your parents didn't do for you. So you will have to learn a brand new skill. You've got nothing to look at and to mirror, because if your parents did it for you, you wouldn't be watching one of these videos. And that's the truth of the matter. You have to learn a new skill. And what we're saying is that skill that we call Shen, that spirituality, is innate in you. And as Alex said earlier, the inner child voice is very loud and demanding and connects to very intense, strong emotions. We're not denying The Shen voice is very quiet, very still. And you have to learn to connect to that, to bring the pendulum back into the middle. And that's the life lesson for you. You have to be the parent that you never had.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. I really hope you enjoyed this particular teaching, part 2. Next week, in part 3, we are going to be talking about the importance of establishing trust through consistency of inner child work and inner child reparenting, and how you can develop that. So please tune in for that. I will put a link in the show notes to part 1 of our inner child reparenting work series, plus our whole inner child work huge playlist, of which there are almost 100 teachings on there. If you have enjoyed this teaching, please do let us know and perhaps share it with someone else who you think it may also help. David works every week with clients all over the world via Zoom video call. And if you'd like to learn more about David's one-to-one consultations, I'll put a link to those in the show notes as well. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new long-form teachings every Saturday, as well as 2 midweek short snippets of wisdom for you. So don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.